In the winter of 1941, a man named Vasily Zaitsev was working in a steel factory in Stalingrad. He was not a soldier. He was not a hunter anymore. He was a factory worker, unremarkable, anonymous, one of thousands who fed the war machine with labor and compliance. But within 2 years, he would become a legend, not because of courage, not because of ideology, but because of a single, devastating skill: the ability to read the forest and kill with absolute precision. The Nazis called him the Death from Nowhere. The Soviets called him the Savior of Stalingrad. The historical record calls him a sniper. But Zaitsev knew what he really was: a hunter who had finally found the only game worth hunting. The story does not begin in war. It begins in silence. Zaitsev was born in 1915 in the Ural Mountains, in a region of taiga and tundra, where the forest stretched for hundreds of kilometers in all directions. His father was a hunter. His grandfather was a hunter. In that part of the Soviet Union, hunting was not a sport, it was survival. At age 10, Zaitsev received his first rifle, a Mosin Nagant with a damaged stock and a misaligned sight. His father took him into the forest and taught him the language that the trees and animals spoke. The angle of a broken branch told you which direction a deer had walked. The pattern of snow on bark told you when the animal had passed, hours or days ago. The scent in the air, the sound of a distant bird, the rustling of leaves that was not wind. All of these were words in a language that most people never learned. By age 16, Zaitsev could hunt alone in complete darkness. He could track a wolf through blizzard conditions. He could estimate the distance to an animal by the size of its eye as it caught the reflection of firelight. These were not supernatural abilities. They were skills, the result of thousands of hours spent in the forest, learning to see what others could not see, to hear what others could not hear, to understand the mathematics of trajectory and wind and gravity through intuition rather than calculation. The factory in Stalingrad changed nothing and everything. Zaitsev worked 10-hour shifts, feeding molten steel into molds. His hands became scarred, his eyes strained in the industrial darkness, but his mind remained in the forest. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Zaitsev was drafted. He was assigned to an infantry division. He was trained to charge, to use his rifle as a club, to die if necessary for the motherland. He was not trained as a sniper. Snipers in the early stages of the war were rare. The Soviet army valued mass and momentum, not precision and patience. But in August 1942, during the German assault on Stalingrad, everything changed. Zaitsev's division was positioned on the western bank of the Volga. The Germans were advancing street by street, house by house. The casualty rate was catastrophic. Men were dying faster than replacements could arrive. In the chaos, a senior officer, a Red Army commander named Danilov, noticed something unusual. A soldier named Zaitsev was killing Germans with a frequency that seemed impossible, not in large numbers, but with consistency, with precision. With an accuracy that suggested not luck but method, Danilov brought Zaitsev to him and asked a single question: "How many Germans have you killed?" Zaitsev did not know the exact number. He had been shooting for weeks in the confusion and smoke of urban combat. He said, "Many, I do not count." Danilov asked another question: "Do you miss?" Zaitsev understood what was being asked. He said, "Not often." Within days, Zaitsev was removed from the infantry line and assigned to a specialized unit, the nascent Soviet Sniper Corps. He was given a Mosin Nagant with a PU scope. He was given a partner, a spotter named Nikolai Kulikov, and he was given a mission: to defend Stalingrad from the towers, the rubble, the frozen ruins where the Germans were dying by the thousands and taking Russians with them. Zaitsev was not trained in the traditional sense. The Red Army did not have the luxury of time or resources for formal sniper schools. Instead, he was given his rifle, his scope, and orders to kill. Everything else, wind compensation, ranging, target prioritization, he would teach himself, using the same instincts that had guided him through the Urals as a boy. The first week, he killed 43 German soldiers. The second week, 68. By the third week, the Germans were avoiding entire sectors of the city because Zaitsev was there. They did not know his name. They did not know his face. They only knew that if they exposed themselves, they died. It was not a matter of luck or probability. It was certainty. And certainty in war is more terrifying than any weapon. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. The Nazis understood what was happening before the Soviets fully grasped it. By November 1942, German military intelligence had identified a sniper of unusual lethality operating in the southern sector of Stalingrad. The reports were clinical. A skilled marksman, likely trained in hunting, effective range approximately 800 meters. Kills concentrated among officer corps and machine gunners. Pattern suggests methodical target selection rather than random fire. The German response was equally methodical. They sent their own sniper, Major Erwin König, a Wehrmacht officer with 59 confirmed kills. König was not a hunter. He was a professional soldier, trained in Prussia, disciplined in technique, psychologically hardened by years of combat. He was brought to Stalingrad with a specific mission: to find and kill the Soviet sniper. What followed was not a simple exchange of gunfire. It was a duel. Two men separated by kilometers of rubble and frozen streets, each trying to understand the mind of the other, each trying to predict where the other would position himself next. The psychological warfare began immediately. The Germans broadcast radio messages. "Zaitsev, we know your name. We know you are there. König is coming. König does not miss." The messages were designed to create fear, to provoke a response, to force Zaitsev into a careless action. Zaitsev's response was silence. He continued his work. He killed methodically. He moved constantly. He told Kulikov, his spotter, "König wants me to panic. But panic is not in the forest. In the forest, you wait, you think, you move when the time is right." For 3 weeks, the two snipers hunted each other. The casualties continued to mount. German soldiers died. Soviet soldiers died. But the focus of the conflict narrowed to 2 men, 2 rifles, and a question of superior skill. The legend, the one that would be repeated after the war in books and films, told of a dramatic final confrontation, a moment when Zaitsev and König faced each other directly. The historical record is more ambiguous. What is certain is that by early December 1942, König was dead. Whether he was killed by Zaitsev in direct combat, or whether he was wounded and evacuated and died later in a field hospital, the records do not clearly state. But König never returned to Stalingrad, and Zaitsev remained. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers began to fear the snow itself, as if the white expanse had become a conscious enemy. They moved in smaller groups. They exposed themselves less frequently. They died more slowly, but they still died. Zaitsev had killed over 200 German soldiers by the end of 1942. By mid-1943, the number approached 250. The Red Army propaganda machine seized on the narrative. A simple hunter from the Urals, armed with nothing but skill and Soviet determination, killing the master race one shot at a time. Zaitsev was promoted. He was decorated. He was made into a symbol. But the reality was more complex. Zaitsev's accuracy came not from superhuman talent, but from a systematic understanding of ballistics and psychology that he had developed over months of constant practice. He kept records, written in a small notebook, of every shot, every distance, every wind condition. He noted how the Mosin Nagant sights drifted in cold. He observed that at distances over 600 meters, wind became the dominant factor in accuracy. He learned to adjust his aim not just for elevation and windage, but for air density, for the movement of distant targets, for the psychological state of his own body, fatigue, cold, fear. Most importantly, he learned to think like his targets. He studied German military tactics. He understood that Germans valued order and discipline. They would tend to repeat movements, to follow routines, to position themselves in predictable locations. He learned that German officers carried binoculars and that the reflection of glass could be seen from great distances. He learned that machine gunners, after firing, would often shift their position by exactly the same distance. He learned to read the battlefield the way he had read the forest, not as a random collection of events, but as a pattern with rules, with logic, with predictability. Kulikov, his spotter, was essential to this process. Kulikov was not a marksman. He was an observer, a mathematician with a degree from Moscow University. Together, they developed a system. Kulikov would calculate distances using a rangefinder. Zaitsev would adjust his scope. Kulikov would observe wind flags and adjust Zaitsev's aim recommendation. They communicated in whispers, in hand signals, in a language of absolute precision. They were not two men. They were a machine, a killing machine, refined through repetition, calibrated through mathematics and blood. By 1943, Zaitsev's reputation had reached Berlin. The Nazi propaganda ministry began publishing articles about him, not to glorify him, but to humanize him, to make him seem less like a symbol and more like a man with weaknesses, with doubts, with the capacity to fail. German newspapers wrote, "The so-called Soviet sniper is merely a man, prey to fear like all men. He will be found. He will be killed. The master race will prevail." But the Germans were losing ground. Stalingrad fell in February 1943. The Red Army began pushing westward. Zaitsev was transferred to new positions, new sectors of the front. His body count continued to rise, 300 kills, 350, 400. The Red Army began using him as a symbol of Soviet superiority in a new way, not as propaganda, but as proof that discipline and science could overcome ideology and tradition. Soviet sniper schools began teaching Zaitsev's methods. Young men were brought to him to learn. He taught them what his father had taught him 60 years earlier, that killing, like hunting, was a discipline that required patience, observation, and a willingness to sit in silence for hours, waiting for the moment of truth. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. But the war was grinding Zaitsev down in ways that medals could not acknowledge. In 1943, a German artillery shell explosion near his position caused shrapnel wounds to his face and eyes. For several weeks, he was partially blind. The Red Army kept this secret. They could not allow the myth to crack. Zaitsev returned to duty despite the damage. His vision was impaired, but his instincts remained. He continued to kill, but the shots required more calculation now. He could no longer rely on his eyes alone. He relied on the mathematics, on the system he and Kulikov had developed, on the almost supernatural ability to predict where a target would be before he saw it. In private, Zaitsev began to speak about the weight of what he had become. In a diary entry dated March 1943, he wrote, "I have killed so many that I no longer remember faces. I remember positions. I remember distances. I remember the sound the rifle makes in cold air. But the men themselves, they are no longer real. They are targets, numbers, geometry problems to be solved. I do not know if this is madness or clarity. Perhaps they are the same thing." He wrote to his mother, a letter that was never sent, discovered decades later in a Russian archive. "Mother, I have become the thing I hunted in the forest. I am the predator now." But predators do not think about the morality of hunting. They simply hunt because it is their nature. I wonder sometimes if I have lost my humanity or if I have finally found it in the absolute clarity of purpose that hunting requires. The psychological cost manifested in ways that the Soviet military could not control. Zaitsev developed insomnia. He would lie awake for hours, reviewing shots, analyzing trajectories, visualizing targets that had already been killed. His hands trembled when he was not holding the rifle. Kulikov noticed these signs but said nothing. In war, a soldier's mental state was irrelevant. Only results mattered. By 1944, Zaitsev had killed over 500 German soldiers. The exact number was disputed even at the time. Some sources claimed 600, others claimed 800. The Soviet propaganda machine inflated the numbers whenever useful. The truth was that precision was impossible. In the chaos of warfare, in the confusion of multiple fronts and changing positions, it was impossible to confirm every kill. But the documented, verified kills numbered over 500. And that number alone was unprecedented in the history of sniping. The end of the war brought no clarity to Zaitsev's story, only confusion and silence. After 1945, the Soviet Union attempted to control the narrative of its own victory. Zaitsev was celebrated publicly, but also carefully monitored. The Red Army was suspicious of soldiers who became too famous, too independent, too capable of generating their own mythology. Zaitsev was assigned to training duties. He taught at sniper schools. He gave speeches about Soviet determination and discipline. But the transition from hunter to teacher, from killer to instructor, was psychologically devastating in ways that official records did not acknowledge. In 1946, Zaitsev was injured in a training accident, shot by a recruit's careless discharge of a rifle. The injury was serious enough to limit his mobility. He was discharged from the Red Army and sent home to Stalingrad. The city was being rebuilt. The rubble where Zaitsev had spent months killing Germans was being cleared away. New buildings were rising. The past was being buried under Soviet concrete and Soviet ideology. Zaitsev returned to factory work, not steel production this time, but light manufacturing. He was recognized sometimes by people who had heard the stories, but he did not encourage their attention. He married. He had children. He lived a life of deliberate ordinariness. In interviews conducted decades later, when the Soviet Union itself was crumbling, Zaitsev was asked about his wartime experiences. His responses were measured, almost emotionless. "I did what was necessary," he said. "I was skilled with a rifle. The Nazis were the enemy. I killed them. There is nothing more to say." But privately, in conversations with close friends and family, a different picture emerged. Zaitsev spoke about the psychological weight of having taken so many lives. He spoke about nightmares where he could see the faces of men he had killed, faces he had never actually seen, but that his mind reconstructed from memories of their positions, their clothing, their last moments. He spoke about the strange disconnection between the public hero that the Soviet Union had made him and the private man who struggled to reconcile what he had done with who he believed himself to be. Zaitsev died in 1991, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. He was 76 years old. His death received minimal attention in the international press, though the Russian media published obituaries that celebrated his wartime service. In the decades since his death, his story has been retold, reimagined, and sometimes distorted. A film was made about his duel with Koenig, a duel that historical evidence suggests may not have occurred exactly as portrayed. Books were written analyzing his techniques. Military academies studied his methods, but the essential truth, that a hunter from the Urals had applied the skills of his father and his grandfather to the business of industrial warfare, remained constant. The rifle Zaitsev carried during the war was preserved. It is now in a Russian military museum, alongside thousands of other artifacts of the Great Patriotic War. Visitors look at it and see the instrument of death. But Zaitsev saw something different. He saw the extension of a skill that had been passed down through generations, refined through practice, perfected in an environment where the difference between life and death was measured in meters and fractions of a second. The forest that raised Zaitsev was destroyed during the Soviet era. Vast sections of the Ural taiga were clear-cut for timber. Rivers were diverted. Wildlife populations collapsed. The landscape where Zaitsev learned to hunt became an industrial site, no longer recognizable to anyone who had known it in his childhood. In a certain philosophical sense, this was fitting. The world that had produced Zaitsev, a world of silence and skill and direct connection between hunter and prey, was itself being hunted to extinction by the 20th century. In 2005, a historian named Dmitry Volkogonov was researching the Stalingrad campaign when he discovered Zaitsev's personal notebooks in a sealed archive. The notebooks were technical in nature, detailed records of wind conditions, ranging techniques, calculations of ballistic trajectories. But interspersed throughout were fragments of a different kind of writing, personal reflections, doubts, questions about the morality of what Zaitsev had become. One entry, dated November 1943, read, "Today I killed a boy who could not have been more than 16 years old. He was carrying ammunition. I shot him from 400 meters. He did not know I was there. I did not know he was a boy until Kulikov looked through the scope and told me. The boy was already dead by then. I wonder what his name was. I wonder if his mother knows he is dead. I will never know these things." Another entry. From December 1943, "The Nazis speak of me as if I am a demon, but I am no different from them. I kill because I am told to kill, because I am skilled at killing, because in war, killing is the measure of success. There is no difference between a Nazi who kills Russians and a Russian who kills Nazis. We are all the same machine, operating under different flags. The machine does not have morality. It only has function." These entries were suppressed by the Russian military. They were classified as state secrets and kept in restricted archives. The official narrative remained the one of the heroic sniper, the Soviet champion, the man who had defeated the Nazi master race through discipline and precision. But the true narrative, the one written by Zaitsev himself in moments of private reflection, was more complex. It was the story of a man who had been transformed by war, who had used his hunter's skills to become a killer on an industrial scale, and who had spent the rest of his life struggling to reconcile that transformation with his own humanity. The lesson encoded in Zaitsev's story was not the one that Soviet propaganda wanted the world to hear. It was not about the triumph of the Soviet system or the superiority of Russian soldiers or the inevitable victory of communism over fascism. The real lesson was simpler and more troubling. Skill is morally neutral. The abilities that Zaitsev's father had taught him, patience, observation, the capacity to remain absolutely still, the understanding of ballistics and wind and distance. These were not inherently good or bad. They were tools. In the hands of a hunter pursuing animals, they were necessary for survival. In the hands of a soldier pursuing enemies, they became instruments of death, and in both cases they required the same discipline, the same focus, the same willingness to kill. Zaitsev had transformed the skills of his grandfather into the skills of a sniper without fundamentally changing their nature. He had taken the language of the forest, the reading of wind and distance and movement, and applied it to the landscape of industrial warfare. The precision he had developed through thousands of hours of hunting became precision applied to killing men. And that precision, multiplied across hundreds of confirmed kills, made him a legend. But Zaitsev himself seemed to understand, in his final years, that this transformation had cost him something essential. The man who had loved the forest, who had understood the relationship between hunter and prey as a natural part of existence, had become something else entirely, a machine for converting distance and trajectory into death. The forest that had made him was gone. The skills that the forest had taught him had been weaponized. And the boy who had received his first rifle in the Urals, excited by the prospect of hunting wolves, had become a soldier who could calculate the ballistic coefficient of a bullet and adjust for windage and distance with absolute precision. The snow still falls in the Urals. The forests are beginning to return slowly, as old industrial sites are abandoned. But the world that Zaitsev knew, the world of patient hunters and absolute silence and direct connection between skill and survival, will not return. It exists now only in memory and in the carefully controlled narratives of war. The hunter who killed for necessity has been replaced by the soldier who kills for state and ideology. And the difference between them, though profound, is often invisible to those who only see the results: men dead, objectives achieved, wars won or lost. Zaitsev's rifle remains in the museum. Visitors look at it and see a weapon. But it is also something else, a record of a particular moment in history when the skills of the old world were conscripted into the service of the new one, when the hunter became the sniper, when precision became death. When the forest, in a sense, marched into the industrial age and learned to kill in kilometers instead of meters. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.